The Department of Water and Sanitation has moved to clear up confusion surrounding the race quotas for water licenses. The most recent Agribusiness Confidence Index is on the worst levels seen since COVID-19. Now, for more on this, we are joined by the CEO of Agbiz, Theo Boshoff. Mr. Boshoff, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, the race quotas that are being implemented by the Department of Agriculture, why do you believe that when it comes to the issuing of water use licenses, it would be catastrophic for the agricultural sector in terms of food security?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. So I think a couple of things are important to note. Firstly, it's not been implemented yet. So it's a proposal that's currently on the table. And it's obviously been put on the table by the Department of Water and Sanitation in draft regulations that were published for public comment. So the National Water Act, which does currently apply in South Africa, does have a strong element of transformation of water sector reform in it, but these factors need to be weighed up with different factors. So essentially what the regulations proposed would be a percentage shareholding that's required for any new license application. Depending on the consumption of water, it would move up between either 25, 50, 75% black shareholding that would be required in an entity to obtain a new water use license for the large consumptive water use like irrigation, for instance. Now, some of the challenges that this poses, obviously, is it would require many companies, many existing transformation deals to then rejig themselves completely. So to a large extent, it is a bit of a blunt instrument. When you do look at the way the National Water Act currently applies, and there's been many court cases that confirm this, it's a nuanced approach. So yes, you do seek to advance transformation, and the sector is very much committed to that. But BEE, Black Economic Empowerment, is typically the measure used to judge a company's transformation status especially when with companies. When it's natural persons, individuals applying for water use licenses, that's obviously a different story. They look at. But when you look at companies, the BEE framework provides a bit more of a nuanced approach. So you have ownership, you look, for instance, at management control, employment equity. So in other words, do you have historically disadvantaged persons within the management structures of the company? You look at how, whether or not a business supports black businesses, for instance, through its procurement, through enterprise development. So it's a bit more of a nuanced and a balanced approach that seeks to get the most out of what companies in different size companies in different areas can achieve. So essentially, I think what the concerns have been, and then this is the measure right across the economy with different entities. The challenge with the proposed water regulations is prescribing a specific percentage and only focusing on ownership. That kind of skews it quite a lot. So many companies and many actual flagship transformation deals and joint ventures in the sector don't necessarily fall within that specific categories. So it's new requirements, I think shifting the goalpost. Those are some of the challenges. Of course, water security is vital to agriculture. Without water, you can't do much in terms of agriculture. So certainly the approach to promote transformation is not the issue. It's simply the mechanism in which it's done. It must align with the existing efforts, existing plans that both, the Department of Agriculture and industry through, for instance, the Agricultural and Agro-Processing Master Plan have proposed types of joint ventures and targets and ways to try to promote transformation. It needs to be aligned to these sort of existing initiatives.
But Theo, the department argues that this only applies, one, to new applications, and it also has gone on to say that 98.5% of the available water resources in South Africa have already been allocated. So this only applies to that 1.5% that hasn't been allocated. So in my understanding, the existing farmers are not affected by this.
It does depend. I do hear that that's the intention, and I think in our comments and our engagements with the department, part of the challenge has been that perhaps the intention isn't reflected in terms of the current wording. A water use license is valid for 5 years. It must be renewed after 5 years. So there's still question marks about whether or not when water use licenses get renewed, the same criteria will apply. And then you also have got various different types of water use authorizations in South Africa. Many of them, as a transitional provision, are still operating on old so-called existing lawful use rights. In other words, if water use, when the new Water Act came in 1998, 2008, it recognized and it continued to recognize all existing water uses that isn't necessarily registered or in the format of a water use license. So there's a possibility, of course, that if those entities want to expand, if those entities need to, perhaps change ownership and bring in new partners into the business, a water use license would have to be applied. So it's a bit of more of a nuanced approach. I do understand if you have an existing water use license, it might not apply until you need to renew it. However, there are concerns about both renewal as well as, of course, expansion. And again, in the Agriculture and Agro-Processing Master Plan that was negotiated between all stakeholders and the department, there are areas that obviously the agriculture sector is looking to expand, and part of it does speak to new water use rights. Another aspect where it can become very relevant is there are huge amounts of investments going into water use efficiency. And that's one way to make additional water use available. So in other words, if your existing water use can become more efficient, you can make new water available essentially for expansion, new plantings. That would then, of course, be subject to new water use license. So it is a bit more nuanced than that. And I think it might very well apply, I think, a little bit wider than perhaps what the department envisages.
So the spirit of the race quotas is to encourage transformation. How differently would you then suggest that this approach be taken?
So there's a number of aspects that need to be considered. So firstly, I think there's a challenge in terms of measuring, if I can say, measuring the race of a company or a trust, and the vast majority of agricultural businesses, or actually farms under irrigation, are businesses. So they're either companies, closed corporations, trusts. It becomes very difficult, in terms of measuring whether it's, to put it bluntly, a white company or a black company. And that's where BE comes in. There's a point system, there's a scoring system. This is recognized in the whole rest of the economy. So I think, firstly, that needs to be aligned. I think looking only purely at ownership, that's a little bit misleading. So first of all, you have to have that balanced approach. Secondly, you also need to have a nuanced approach in terms of how and when it applies. For instance, if there's no competition for water or competing interest for the same water resource, then obviously it has to be looked at differently. And there's been court cases in the Supreme Court of Appeal that is confirmed. I mean, there's 13 or 14 different considerations that the Act states the authority has to take into consideration when awarding a water use license. So an element of it is advancing transformation, but it's also security of supply. So if there's existing lawful use, that also counts in your favor to continue using it. Investments made into effectively using the water, the jobs that can be created through the use of the water, the expansion of the economy, foreign earnings. So there's a whole bunch of different factors that must be weighed up, and in that, one does seek to advance transformation, but it can't be elevated above all the, as a blanket requirement above all the other requirements. And as I mentioned, there might be instances. So if there are competing applications for the same water resource, and of course some of them are more advanced in BE than others, then that's, I think, a relatively simple one to apply. But if it's not the case, and you've got multiple applications, or if you have a single application or multiple applications with more or less the same transformation status in the companies, it becomes a little bit more difficult, a bit more nuanced to apply. And I think that's where hard and fast requirements will be a challenge. The final aspect, and I mean, again, it's draft regulations, it's a proposal, so it's still subject to change. And we believe, based on the comments, it probably will change. Because the Act has to be interpreted in a certain way, it has all of those requirements. The regulations, which is subject to the Act, the regulations can expand on the requirements contained in an Act. It can't introduce completely new requirements or change the way an Act should be interpreted. So there is also quite a strong legal argument to be made that in its current format, most likely it is unlawful. And that's why I think a more nuanced approach will have to be brought in any event.
So, like you say, it is still in draft. The department has opened up for submissions. What's the next step?
So the next step is, of course, the interested parties, like ourselves, will submit comments, and I think constructive comments. And after that, there'll be an opportunity, we hope, to engage with the department through the various channels to bring some of the arguments to assist with arriving at a bit more of a nuanced approach and process to these water use licenses without changing necessarily the essence. As I mentioned, the essence of it is to promote transformation, which is supported, but the manner in which it's done has to be slightly more nuanced. So after the comment period has ended, of course, the department has to take all these comments into consideration. We'll most likely have to have a look at redrafting certain provisions in the regulations before it's finally published by the minister and once it's published in its final format, of course, then it will become law and then it applies.
All right, thank you so much for your time this evening. That was Agba's CEO, Mr. Theo Boshoff, speaking to us there about the race quotas with regards to the water use licenses.